Lisbon, 1889. The year begins not with celebration, but with unease. For this is a city that has already known plague, fire, and famine, and yet it fears something quieter, an infirmary, whose doors close in a way no door meant for mercy ever should. The opening account is simple, almost architectural, a ward designed so that once a patient entered, the door could only be secured from the nurse's side. A lock turned not to keep intruders out, but to keep the ill from leaving. At first glance it might seem a matter of practical design, a precaution for safety. Yet in this case, the very wood and iron of those doors would become the fulcrum of whispered horror. The institution in question was called São Bartolomeu Infirmary. Perched on a narrow hill above the Alfama quarter, it had the appearance of sanctity, whitewashed walls, a crucifix above its entrance, the faint scent of lavender masking the odor of lye. Lisbon citizens passed it daily, nodding with a mixture of gratitude and dread, for one only entered such a place in desperation. They called it a house of rest for the weary, but mothers warned children never to linger at its gates. The paradox was plain. What was intended as sanctuary resembled a place of confinement, and what was meant as relief left. Those who entered spoken, of only in hushed tones afterward. In this account, we are not dealing with a tale of demons or fanciful spirits, but of bricks and doors, of men and women in uniforms who swore oaths of care. That perhaps is why the story endures. It confronts us with the unbearable possibility that suffering is not born from the unknown, but from the very institutions to which one turns for help. The contrast between hope and betrayal, between the promise of medicine and the reality of custody, is what gives this narrative its enduring weight. By 1889, Lisbon was at the edge of a transformation. Its streets glowed with new gas lamps, while cholera still haunted its lower quarters. Doctors spoke in the language of science, while priests offered blessings in Latin. To send one's loved one into an infirmary was an act of trust, but also of surrender. Families released their kin into the hands of strangers, believing the door that closed behind them would protect, not imprison. That lock, turned gently by the nurse each evening, became a symbol not of safety, but of separation. Witnesses from the time describe hearing the click of the wards at dusk. The corridors fell silent, the lamps were dimmed, and the city outside carried on with its clamor of carts and bells. Inside, however, patients were now held in a place where leaving was no longer their choice. No other house in Lisbon, not the jails nor the convents, possessed doors that turned in such a way. This design, both mundane and monstrous, is the beginning of our case. And so before we proceed further, a word of care to you, the listener. What follows is a reconstruction based on fragmentary accounts, reports suppressed in official ledgers, and testimonies later unearthed from private journals. It is a story of neglect, of silence, and of confinement in the very place meant to heal. The details may unsettle and at times disturb, for this is not an account of ghosts, but of people abandoned to systems that chose convenience over compassion. Consider this both a dramatization note and a content warning. What you are about to hear is drawn from the darkest margins of the historical record, told not for shock, but so the silence may not continue unchallenged. Before we turn deeper into the investigation, a small invitation, one that grounds us in the present while we peer into the past. Where are you listening from? Across continents, across years? This story reaches you now, and your place, your city, your own sense of safety, becomes part of the lens through which this tale is understood. For while this infirmary stood in Lisbon more than a century ago, the question it poses remains timeless. When does a place of care become a place of custody? And how can one tell the difference before the door shuts behind them? This account must pause briefly, before the descent grows darker, to clarify what you are hearing and how it is told. The material has been gathered not as a complete chronicle, but from fragments, loose leaf reports, parish notes, faded correspondence, and the occasional private recollection. Much of it was never intended for public eyes. Some lines are barely legible. Others have been redacted with a deliberate hand. What you will hear has been reconstructed, shaped into a narrative that seeks coherence without claiming certainty. In short, it is dramatization, not invention. The boundary between record and interpretation is thin, and you deserve to know when it is being crossed. Ethical responsibility demands this note. There are names within these records, patients, attendants, inspectors, whose lives were marked by illness, silence, or scandal. To retell their story risks reducing them to roles: victim, perpetrator, witness. We must resist that flattening. Each was a person of flesh and worry, of faith and frailty. Their suffering is not our entertainment. It is our caution. What you are about to hear is offered with respect to those whose voices were muted by woes and locks. Yet the paradox cannot be ignored. For the story to be remembered, it must also be told with force, with detail, with the weight of horror that institutions tried to erase. This is the tension at the heart of any historical reconstruction: truth versus fabrication, reverence versus exposure. We tread between them. Where the record is clear, you will hear their words directly. Where the archive is silent, you will hear what could have been. Grounded in the practices of the time, the architecture still standing, the rituals of nursing and confinement in late 19th century Lisbon. This transparency is not meant to weaken the account, but to strengthen your trust. Without such disclosure, every detail could be dismissed as fiction. With it, the narrative gains its proper contour, a braid of evidence and interpretation, of fact and reflection. Imagine the dim handwriting of a nurse's journal. Imagine the brittle paper of a parish complaint, ink blurred by candle soot. These are not inventions. They are artifacts that survive, however incomplete. It is from them that the scaffolding of this tale has been raised. There is finally a second caution, one of feeling rather than fact. The episodes you will hear describe abandonment, confinement, and the betrayal of trust in those charged with healing. They may unsettle you not through blood or violence, but through the quiet suffocation of neglect. That perhaps is harder to bear. If at times you find yourself wishing to turn away, know that such discomfort was also felt by those who lived near the infirmary, who heard the bells at night and chose silence rather than confrontation. To carry that unease is to step, however briefly, into their world. And so with these clarifications given, the narrative may continue in good faith. We return now to Lisbon in 1889, where the city bustled with trade and rumor, and where behind the respectable white facade of São Bartolomeu Infirmary, the door still turned inward, locking from the nurse's side. Lisbon in 1889 was a city poised between centuries, a capital of faded grandeur and restless modern ambition. Along the broad avenues of Baixa and Chiado, carriages rattled past cafes, where men debated politics and poets drafted verses about empire and decline. Yet only a few streets away, in the sloped alleys of Alfama or Muraria, poverty clung as tightly as the salt air that drifted up from the Tagus, laundry. Hung from iron balconies, children chased one another over cobblestones worn by generations. This was a city of contrast, where light and shadow existed not in metaphor alone, but in the very fabric of daily life. Disease haunted Lisbon with the persistence of an unwelcome guest. Cholera, which had swept through in previous decades, was not forgotten. Families still whispered about those lost in fevers, bodies carted away at dawn to mass graves. The fear of sudden illness meant infirmaries, and hospitals carried immense symbolic weight. They were both sanctuaries of hope and reminders of vulnerability. Citizens sought their aid reluctantly, for while medicine promised salvation, it also meant surrendering oneself to the authority of doctors and the judgment of nurses, often strangers whose training was uneven at best. Faith and science lived side by side in this world, rarely in harmony, often in competition. On Sundays, the bells of churches drew the devout into pews where priests preached of patience, humility, and divine will. But in lecture halls across the city, medical men discussed bacteria, nutrition, and architecture as tools of progress. The old order proclaimed that suffering was God's design. The new science suggested it was human error or human neglect that killed. For a family debating whether to place a loved one in the care of São Bartolomeu Infirmary, these tensions mattered. Was trust to be given to the physician's instruments or to the priest's prayers? Each choice carried the weight of both salvation and betrayal. Economically, Lisbon was fragile. The nation's empire had shrunk. Its treasury was thin. Charitable institutions filled the gaps, many run by religious orders with limited oversight. Infirmaries, often underfunded, were caught between lofty rhetoric of Christian charity, and the daily reality of too few hands to tend too many bodies. Beds were crowded, food rations inconsistent, records irregular. For the poor there was rarely another option. The affluent could afford private physicians, visits at home, and the safety of avoiding public wards. This divide between privilege and poverty was inscribed in the very walls of institutions like São Bartolomeu. Lisbon itself seemed a city of thresholds. The sea promised openness, yet the alleys confined. The grand plazas celebrated progress, while epidemics reminded citizens of fragility. It was in this tension that the infirmary stood, its whitewashed walls glowing in the sun as a symbol of care, while inside, shadows lengthened along corridors where doors locked from the wrong side. For neighbors and passers-by, the building represented mercy, yet rumors described it as a storehouse of despair. This dual identity, sanctuary and prison, was not accidental, but born of the contradictions that shaped Lisbon at the end of the 19th century. To understand what would unfold inside its wards, one must first grasp this larger atmosphere. Families who sent loved ones into São Bartolomeu did so not out of confidence, but desperation. They knew the city was ill-prepared to care for its weakest. They trusted because they had no choice. In this, the infirmary was less an exception than a mirror, reflecting the fractures of a society caught between belief and doubt, hope and neglect, the promise of progress and the weight of tradition. The building that Lisbon knew as São Bartolomeu Infirmary stood on the crest of a hill that overlooked the river, a structure at once modest and imposing. From a distance its walls shone pale in the sunlight, whitewashed every spring as a ritual of both sanitation and display. A crucifix was mounted above the entrance arch, weathered by rain, its Christ figure worn, smooth where generations of hands had touched it in search of comfort. To a passerby it looked like a house of mercy, a place where Christian charity and medical science intertwined. Yet to those who lived in its shadow, the building told a different story. Approach the gates and one noticed the quiet. There were no sounds of laughter, no chatter of recovery. Instead, faint groans carried on the wind, muffled by thick walls and shuttered windows. The front courtyard was swept clean, but the smell of carbolic acid hung in the air, mingling with the smoke of the city's coal fires. It was a facade of order, concealing corridors where order was maintained through silence, rather than healing. Residents of the Alfama quarter passed by quickly, muttering blessings under their breath. They knew that once someone entered those doors, their return was never guaranteed. The infirmary's architecture reflected its contradictions. The wards were long and narrow, with high ceilings designed to let in light, yet the windows were set so high that patients could not see the city outside. It was a form of isolation disguised as ventilation. At the center of each ward stood heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron bolts, that locked only from the nurse's side. This feature, so practical to administrators who feared unruly patients, created an atmosphere of captivity. The patients themselves had no agency, no control over their exit. A sanctuary by design became a cage. Inside, the infirmary was divided into three principal wings. One was reserved for women, another for men, and the smallest wing for children. Each was overseen by a matron, often a woman of stern, religious bearing who believed discipline was the highest form of care. Beds were arranged in rigid rows, straw mattresses covered with thin linens. At night, the only light came from oil lamps, their flickering shadows stretching across walls damp with moisture. The ward smelled of sweat, disinfectant, and despair. To some, it was a place of healing. To others, it was indistinguishable from a jail. Newspapers of the time described São Bartolomeu in glowing terms, a beacon of order, a triumph of Christian compassion. But the poor who lived nearby whispered otherwise. They spoke of bells that rang at odd hours, of families who delivered their kin and never saw them again, of bodies carried out in the dark of morning with no explanation given. These rumors existed in uneasy balance with the public image of mercy. Reputation versus reality, the tension, at the heart of the infirmary, kept the city both proud of and unsettled by its presence. The staff themselves were not without conflict. Nurses, drawn mostly from convent orders, lived within the building and obeyed a strict hierarchy. Their duties ranged from tending wounds to enforcing silence. A handful of secular doctors visited during the day, but their authority ended at dusk. By evening, it was the nurses who held the keys, who walked the corridors with rosaries, at their belts and keys jangling at their sides. For the patients, the sound of those keys meant the finality of the lock, a reminder that they were no longer free. This was the São Bartolomeu Infirmary in 1889, a structure outwardly aligned with charity, inwardly shaped by control, a place where architecture itself enforced obedience, where the boundary between healing and confinement blurred until it vanished entirely. It stood as both symbol and secret, its whitewashed walls hiding what Lisbon preferred not to see. And it is within those walls that the first of the troubling incidents unfolded, incidents that would expose how easily mercy could turn into captivity. The first known disappearance tied to São Bartolomeu Infirmary occurred in late spring of 1889, when the air in Lisbon was heavy with dust and the scent of salt carried inland from the Tagus. Her name was Maria Ferreira, though the records would later reduce her to initials alone. She was 22, a seamstress by trade, known in her parish for quick hands and a gentle nature. Maria lived with her widowed mother and younger brother in a cramped apartment near Moraria, taking in piecework to keep food on the table. Neighbors remembered her as pale from long hours at the sewing table, with a cough that had troubled her since the winter. When Maria collapsed at her work, the decision to admit her to São Bartolomeu was not made lightly. Her mother hesitated, for she had heard the whispers, patients who entered but never returned, the silence of unanswered inquiries. Yet poverty left no choice. The family could not afford a private physician. With a borrowed cart, Maria was taken to the infirmary gate. Witnesses described her pale face, lips pressed in resignation, as she was carried inside. The heavy door shut, the lock turned softly from the nurse's side, and that was the last her family saw of her. The official account came swiftly. Within 3 days, the mother was informed by a note, unsigned, bearing only the infirmary's seal, that Maria had been transferred to another facility for specialized care. The letter named no institution, no address, no physician. It promised she was receiving appropriate treatment and urged patience. When the mother pressed for details, the porter at the gate told her nothing. A week later, she returned with her son, begging for information. The matron replied only that the infirmary had no further responsibility for the patient. The contrast between what the family experienced and what the public was told was striking. Newspapers mentioned nothing of Maria. Parish records, however, preserve a trace. On May 12, 1889, the priest of São Cristóvão parish recorded a visit from Maria's fiancé, a young cooper named Joachim. In a shaky hand, he demanded that the church intercede. She is said to be moved, but to where? No carriage was seen, no record signed. They have locked her from us. If this is Christian mercy, it is a cruel mercy indeed. This entry, buried among baptisms and deaths, is one of the few surviving artifacts that testifies to Maria's fate. The absence of evidence became its own form of violence. No death certificate was issued in her name. No burial was recorded in municipal cemeteries. It was as if she had been erased from the city, as if the infirmary had swallowed her whole. Her mother wore black for the rest of her days, though she never had a grave to tend. Joachim left Lisbon within a year, his anger noted by neighbors, but silenced in official channels. This first incident established a pattern that would soon repeat. An institution presented as sanctuary instead became a void into which the vulnerable disappeared. Maria's case illustrates the clash between the trust families placed in the infirmary and the evasions they received in return. On one side stood the ordinary citizen, armed only with grief and questions. On the other, a structure of authority that controlled records, gates and narratives. Mercy promised, disappearance delivered. It is through this disappearance that suspicions began to grow. For Maria was not the last to vanish behind those inward-locking doors. She was the first remembered, and perhaps the one who most clearly revealed that São Bartolomeu was not a house of recovery but of silence. The second incident tied to São Bartolomeu was not a single event. but a chorus of disturbances that stretched over several months in 1889, disturbances that the neighbors remembered as the bells at night, unlike the disappearance of the seamstress, which could be explained away as clerical error or quiet tragedy. This phenomenon was public, audible to dozens, perhaps hundreds, who lived within earshot of the infirmary's walls. It was, in many ways, the moment when private unease ripened into collective suspicion. In the city of Lisbon, bells were familiar, almost comforting. Church towers marked the hours. Convent chimes signaled vespers. Ships in the harbour rang out across the water to guide sailors home. But the bells that tolled from São Bartolomeu after midnight were of another kind. Thin, uneven, sometimes frantic, they carried a note of alarm rather than devotion. Residents described them as choking. Bells, the sound of a hand pulling a cord in distress. Some nights the bells were accompanied by muffled cries, as if carried on the drafts that swept down the hillside. At first the neighbors dismissed it as the fevered noise of the sick. Yet as the pattern continued, they began to wonder. Why always at night? Why never an explanation the next morning? By early summer, complaints reached the parish office. Parishioners came forward with near-identical accounts, bells ringing after the city had gone to sleep, followed by silence that felt heavier than noise. On June 17th, the parish register includes a terse note in the priest's own hand. Several souls have testified to disturbances from the infirmary after midnight hours. They hear cries and bell ringing. Upon inquiry, the sisters deny all. Further observation is required. This entry, though short, is one of the rare, preserved artifacts that acknowledges the unease of the neighborhood. The clergy's response, however, revealed the gulf between testimony and authority. When questioned, the matron of São Bartolomeu insisted that no such bells were rung, no such cries heard. She described the witnesses as fevered with imagination and dismissed their words as gossip. To the priests, weary of superstition and eager to avoid scandal, this explanation sufficed. Their sermons urged charity of thought and patience of spirit. The people, they implied, were mishearing the wind. Yet those who lived nearest knew otherwise. One washerwoman told her neighbor that she had counted 11 rings one night, each followed by a thud, as though something heavy struck the floor. A fisherman claimed he woke to the sound of a child sobbing, carried faintly through the still air. Though no one could prove what was happening behind the locked doors, the evidence of ears could not be ignored. This was the contrast at the heart of the second incident: testimony versus denial, lived experience versus institutional dismissal. Over time, the bells became more than noise. They became symbols of fear. Parents threatened disobedient children with the warning, "Hark, the bells of Bartolomeu will take you." Local vendors crossed themselves when passing the gates after dark. The infirmary's facade, once a quiet monument to charity, now bore the weight of suspicion. Every midnight, toll reminded the neighborhood that something inside was wrong, and that those meant to protect the weak were instead complicit in hiding their cries. The official record is sparse. Beyond the parish note, no municipal investigation is documented. Yet the oral tradition persisted, recorded decades later in interviews with surviving neighbors. One old man, recalling his childhood, said, "You could tell the difference between church bells and theirs. Theirs were not rung for God. They were rung by hands that wanted help." Such recollections, though subjective, form the closest we have to testimony from those nights. Thus, the second incident widened the circle of suspicion. Where Maria's disappearance could be contained as a family's tragedy, the bells implicated the community itself. They were heard by many, denied by the few who had the power to speak officially. In the gap between what was heard and what was acknowledged, distrust took root. It would not be long before the pattern grew darker still, and the city confronted evidence that could not be explained away as imagination. The third incident was the one that forced whispers into open outrage, for it concerned not a rumor or a disappearance, but the body of a child returned to his family. His name was Antonio, 8 years old, the son of a dock worker and a washerwoman who lived near the Cais do Sodre in the early days of July 1889. Antonio fell from a cart and broke his leg, a simple fracture that should not have been life-threatening. His parents, unable to pay for a private physician, brought him to São Bartolomeu Infirmary, trusting that the sisters would set the bone and keep him safe until he healed. They carried him through the doors one morning, and though the boy cried from pain, he still clutched his toy wooden soldier, a comfort his father had carved for him. 3 days later, Antonio was returned to them in a coffin. No explanation preceded the delivery, only a curt statement from the matron that he had succumbed to complications. The family, stricken with grief, opened the coffin at home before burial. What they saw made them cry out in anger. The child's small wrists bore deep red marks, the kind made not by illness but by restraint. His ankles showed similar bruises, as though he had been bound. The wooden soldier he had carried was missing. The parents spread word among neighbors, and soon a crowd gathered to view the marks for themselves. Outrage simmered in the tenement halls. A broken leg was not a death sentence, yet the infirmary had returned a child battered and silenced. News traveled quickly through the parish, and witnesses pressed for answers. When questioned, the infirmary staff replied with indifference. They claimed the boy had struggled against treatment, that the bindings were for his own protection, that his death was a tragic but natural event. The explanation satisfied no one. Children were supposed to struggle. They were supposed to cry out. To bind a boy so small, to silence his voice with straps and bolts, was seen as cruelty masquerading as care. The contrast here was stark and undeniable. Innocence versus brutality, the frailty of a child against the cold machinery of institutional discipline. This time evidence accompanied the accusations. An inventory was discovered. Whether smuggled out by a sympathetic nurse or leaked by a careless clerk is uncertain. Preserved among the city archives, it lists restraint devices kept in São Bartolomeu's stores, leather cuffs, iron clasps, padded straps for control of agitated patients. The inventory is precise, dated June 1889, just weeks before Antonio's admission. The inclusion of such instruments in an infirmary meant for healing shocked even the skeptical. They were not described as medical tools but as apparatus for safety and order. In the context of a child's death, they became proof of a darker practice. The artifact, known now as the Bartolomeu Restraints Inventory, survives in fragments. One entry reads, 8 leather wrist straps buckled, 2 in use, 6 stored. Another, 3 iron rings affixed to bed frames, inspected, secure. The language is bureaucratic, detached, yet each line reveals a system that normalized the binding of the weak. This document, unlike rumor or oral testimony, could not be dismissed as imagination. It was ink on paper, official and damning. The family demanded justice. They carried Antonio's small coffin to the parish square and showed the boy's wrists to anyone willing to look. Neighbors wept. Others clenched their fists in anger. A petition circulated, calling for an inquiry into the infirmary's practices. It gathered signatures from dock workers, seamstresses, and vendors alike. The church, however, hesitated. Priests urged restraint, fearing scandal more than injustice. City officials muttered about necessary discipline and the dangers of agitation in wards. The weight of institutional denial pressed heavily against the fragile voices of the poor. Still, the death of a child was harder to bury than the disappearance of a seamstress or the ringing of bells. Antonio's face, remembered by playmates in the streets, became a symbol of what São Bartolomeu truly was. He was not a nameless figure lost in shadow, but a boy who once ran through the markets, clutching his wooden soldier. His loss could not be explained away by silence. In him, Lisbon saw the line between care and cruelty, crossed so clearly that even denial began to falter. Thus, the third incident marked the turning point. With Antonio's death, suspicion hardened into certainty. The infirmary, which presented itself as a sanctuary of healing, was revealed to be a house of restraint. The inventory of devices became evidence, and the bruises on a child's body became testimony. This was no longer a matter of whispers in the night. It was a matter of proof. Inspector Duarte Falcão was not the sort of man Lisbon associated with scandal. In 1889, he was 40 years old, a veteran of the city's police force, known for his cautious manner and methodical mind. He had worked his way up from patrolman to inspector, through patience rather than flair, the kind of man who preferred quiet observation over dramatic confrontation. Colleagues described him as a man of ledgers, always with a notebook at hand, filling page after page with neat script. He believed in facts, in order, in the stability of institutions. If someone like Duarte was sent to examine São Bartolomeu Infirmary, it was not because he was eager to expose corruption, but because his superiors trusted him to bring calm to unrest. The case landed on his desk in early July, shortly after Antonio's funeral. Reports of the boy's bruised body had begun circulating in the Alfama, and the petitions signed by dock workers and seamstresses reached the municipal offices. Officials could not ignore the public anger entirely. They decided that a preliminary inspection would suffice, a gesture of responsiveness without the weight of a full inquiry. Duarte was summoned and told to dispel the rumors with clarity. He was not instructed to uncover wrongdoing. He was expected to restore confidence. The contrast was evident from the start. Authorities' need for silence versus the people's demand for answers. On his first visit to São Bartolomeu, Duarte arrived in plain clothes rather than uniform. Perhaps to avoid drawing attention, he walked slowly through the courtyard, noting the crucifix, the smell of disinfectant, the unnaturally quiet air. A nurse greeted him politely, though with visible tension in her jaw, and led him to the matron's office. There he was offered tea and reassurances. The matron, stern in her black habit, insisted that the rumors were the product of grief-stricken families who misunderstood medical necessity. She showed him the infirmary's Bible, its pages marked with prayers for healing, as though holiness itself could serve as proof of innocence. But Duarte was not satisfied with words alone. He asked to see the wards, and the matron, reluctant but obliged, complied. He moved through long corridors where the air was stale despite high windows. Beds lined the walls, occupied by pale figures who turned their faces away. He noted the way the doors were constructed, thick, iron-bolted, their locks turning only from the side where he and the nurses stood. He paused, testing one with his hand. The sound of the bolt sliding into place was sharp, decisive, and wrong. A place meant to protect the weak should not secure them like prisoners. The detail lodged itself in his mind, sharper than any reassurance offered by the matron. Patients said little as he passed. Some stared at him with hollow eyes, others clutched at their sheets. Duarte wrote later in his notebook, "There is a silence here that is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of watchfulness, as if words themselves are forbidden." He noticed the nurses, carrying keys at their belts, the clink of metal echoing down the corridor. The sound reminded him less of hospital orderlies and more of jailers. At the end of his inspection, Duarte asked for records, admissions, discharges, transfers. What he was shown was incomplete, pages missing or blotted with ink. When he pressed, the matron told him sternly that many families failed to register properly, that deaths were frequent and burials swift. It was a plausible answer, yet unsatisfying. Duarte had investigated crime long enough to recognize evasion. The absence of records was not accidental, it was concealment. That night, he returned to his modest apartment near Rossio Square and wrote for hours. His notes from that first visit read like the beginnings of a case file. Observations of locks, of silences, of faces that seemed too frightened to speak. He was not yet ready to accuse, but he was no longer willing to dismiss. The rumors, he sensed, contained truth. What he needed was proof, something more than suspicion. Thus Inspector Duarte entered the story, a man loyal to order, sent to calm unrest, yet unsettled by what he saw. In him the contrast deepened, authority versus impotence. He had the badge of law, but not the power to force the infirmary to open its hidden rooms. Still he resolved to return, to question further, and to search for the anomalies that would reveal what lay behind those inward-locking doors. Inspector Duarte Falcone returned to São Bartolomeu with sharper intent, determined not to be lulled again by polite words and prepared courtesies. This time he arrived in full uniform, his presence unmistakable, a declaration that his questions carried the weight of the city behind them. The matron met him stiffly at the door, lips pressed tight, hands clasped over her rosary, as though prayer might shield her from inquiry. She insisted he tour only the wards already prepared for visitors, But Duarte refused. He demanded to speak with the staff themselves, nurses, orderlies, even porters, those whose voices might betray what official records concealed. The interrogations began in a small office, its walls lined with crucifixes and ledgers. Duarte asked the nurses simple questions. How many patients had died in the past month? How many were transferred? Where were they sent? The answers varied. One nurse claimed 15 had been buried. Another insisted only 8. A third, flustered, suggested several had been sent away, but when pressed, could not say to which institutions. Duarte noted each inconsistency carefully, his pencil scratching across the page with relentless precision. The orderlies fared no better under his questions. These men, hired for their strength more than their knowledge, spoke in half sentences, glancing toward the door as if fearing who might overhear. One admitted that he had been instructed to carry stretchers not only into the wards, but back out again, empty. When Duarte asked why, the man stammered that it was for practice, his face flushing with shame. Another confessed that he often heard patients cry out in the night but was forbidden to investigate. Their testimonies clashed, but in their very contradictions lay truth. They were not rehearsed, not disciplined into uniformity. They were fragments of honesty slipping through cracks, yet the nurses remained more guarded. They sat upright, eyes lowered, speaking only what the matron would approve. Duarte sensed their fear ran deeper than loyalty. It was survival. He pressed one young nurse, Sister Margarita, about the missing seamstress, Maria Ferreira. Margarita's hands trembled as she folded and refolded her apron. She insisted she remembered nothing. Her eyes, however, betrayed her words. Duarte closed his notebook and leaned closer, lowering his voice. If you have something to tell me, he said, find a way. Even silence leaves a trace. Later that afternoon, as Duarte prepared to leave, Margarita passed him in the corridor. She did not speak. Instead, she brushed against him briefly, and when he glanced down, he found a folded slip of paper tucked into the crease of his glove. He said nothing, slipping it quietly into his coat pocket. Only once he returned to his quarters did he unfold the note, written in hurried, cramped script. It contained just 9 words, not all recover, but all remain within still. Beneath the words was a small cross, drawn in ink, perhaps to mark faith, perhaps to mark fear. The note shook Duarte more than any testimony. It was coded but clear. Patients were not leaving the infirmary. They were being kept, perhaps hidden, perhaps silenced. The phrase "all remain within" suggested not transfers, not burials in distant cemeteries, but confinement behind those inward locking doors. For the first time, Duarte felt that what he faced was not negligence or poor record-keeping, but deliberate concealment. He sat at his desk long into the night, staring at the slip of paper. The handwriting was shaky, the words desperate. Margarita had risked her position, perhaps her safety, to pass it to him. That single artifact became his key, a sign that there were voices inside, some Bartholomew ready to break the silence if he could protect them. But it also carried a warning. If patients remained within, then what lay behind those doors was not a hospital ward, but something far darker. From that day forward, Duarte's role changed. He was no longer a municipal inspector sent to calm the public. He was an investigator facing a wall of secrecy. The contrast sharpened again. Silence versus confession. Concealment versus revelation. One nurse had chosen to speak, if only in code. It was now his task to unravel what her words truly meant, and whether he could bring those still within back into the light. The discovery of Nurse Salazar's journals was not the result of luck, but of quiet persistence. Inspector Duarte had learned from the coded note that the truth was hidden within the infirmary's walls, and he began searching for allies among the staff who might, like Sister Margarita, be willing to risk exposure. One name surfaced repeatedly in whispers: Salazar. She was older than most of the nurses, not a nun but a laywoman, employed before the infirmary's reorganization under the current matron. Some called her difficult. Others said she was not obedient enough. Duarte understood what those descriptions meant. She carried a history of resistance. Arranging a meeting was delicate. Duarte could not summon her openly without alerting the matron. Instead, he returned on the pretense of checking ledgers once more, and contrived to speak with Salazar while she escorted linens to the storage cellars. The woman was in her 50s, her face lined from years of hard labor, her eyes sharp with the kind of weariness that comes from having seen too much. At first she refused to speak beyond formalities, her voice flat, her answers clipped. Duarte sensed fear but also calculation. Finally he mentioned Sister Margarita's note, without revealing its author, and said quietly, "There are others who know." Something in Salazar shifted then. She tightened her grip on the bundle of linens and whispered, "If you want proof, it is not in the ledgers. It is in what I wrote because I could not bear to carry it alone." She agreed to meet Duarte after Vespers, at the chapel gate, where the infirmary grounds met the cobbled street. That evening, as the bells of nearby churches rang softly for prayer, Salazar appeared with a worn satchel. From it she produced 3 small notebooks, their covers frayed, their pages stained with ink and candle wax. "I wrote them in secret," she confessed. "When no one listened, I wrote. When I saw things I could not unsee, I wrote. If they discover I gave you these, I am finished." Perhaps worse. Duarte assured her of protection, though he knew the promise was fragile. The infirmary's reach was long, and the city preferred silence over scandal. Still, he took the journals with solemnity, tucking them inside his coat as if they were sacred relics. The contents of the journals were damning. Salazar had kept her notes chronologically, beginning in late 1887, when she first noticed irregularities. The early pages described patients locked into wards for entire days. Their meals slid under the door rather than served in person. Later entries detailed the sounds, moans, thuds, scratching against wood, that went unanswered by the staff. "We are instructed to ignore," she wrote on February 4, 1888. "Even if they beg, even if they strike their heads against the walls. We must not open until permitted. To open without order is cause for dismissal." Other passages spoke of restraints. On September 22, 1888, she described seeing a storeroom filled with leather straps and iron cuffs, catalogued as medical equipment. "They call it therapy," she wrote bitterly. "But I know therapy is not meant to draw blood." She recorded bruises on wrists, ligature marks on ankles, and patients too weak to lift their heads. "They are not treated. They are subdued," one line read. Most chilling were the entries concerning deaths. On December 11, 1888, she wrote, "The child Antonio screamed until hoarse. When silence came, it was not recovery. The body was carried out before dawn. The matron said he was taken to Santa Maria. I have seen the grave with my own eyes. It is here in the back garden, unmarked." Each page was an indictment, but Salazar's voice was not one of hysteria. It was steady, deliberate, the tone of someone compelled by conscience to record truth, even if no one believed her. She signed each entry with her initials, A.S., as if daring someone to challenge her account. Duarte copied several passages into his official notebook, but the originals he kept hidden, recognizing their explosive potential. The journals provided not only testimony, but proof that the pattern of abuse was systematic, not accidental. They revealed an institution that used the language of medicine and charity to mask practices of confinement and neglect. They also showed Duarte the limits of his authority. To confront the infirmary publicly with such material would require allies in higher office, men willing to tarnish the reputation of a charitable institution tied to the church. He was not yet sure such allies existed. Still, with Salazar's journals in hand, Duarte felt the case sharpen into focus. The rumors, the bells, the bruised child, the coded note, all of it was confirmed by these pages. There was no longer room for doubt. The infirmary's facade of holiness hid a machinery of suffering. The contrast became unbearable. Written truth versus official silence. The testimony of a nurse against the weight of an institution. For now, Duarte kept the journals locked in his desk drawer, away from prying eyes. He knew they were dangerous, not only for Salazar but for himself. Yet he also knew they were indispensable, a lantern in the darkness of San Bartolomeo. They transformed suspicion into evidence, and evidence into duty. The question that haunted him now was not whether the infirmary was guilty, but whether he could bring its crimes into daylight before more lives were extinguished behind those inward locking doors. Inspector Duarte Falcão approached the matter of escalation with the same restraint that had carried him through years of police work. He did not storm into offices or wave Nurse Salazar's journals like a banner. Instead, he began with memoranda, quiet, carefully worded reports submitted to his superiors at the Municipal Police Bureau. These reports summarized his observations in measured terms: discrepancies in patient records, irregularities in discharge accounts, contradictory testimonies among the staff. At the end of each document, however, he added a sentence that unsettled his colleagues. "I recommend a formal inquiry, with judicial authority, to access restricted wards and storage rooms." The response was tepid. His immediate superior, Captain Teixeira, read the papers with a frown, then set them aside. "These are sensitive matters," he told Duarte, lowering his voice. "The infirmary is under the protection of both the church and the crown. To accuse them of misconduct, let alone cruelty, would be disruptive. Lisbon is not in need of scandal." His words were polite but final. Duarte left the office with the taste of iron in his mouth, the taste of institutional fear. Refusing to yield, he sought allies among the municipal council. He arranged a discreet meeting with Councillor Rodriguez, a man known for his reformist sympathies. Duarte laid out portions of Salazar's journals, choosing passages that described restraints, bruises, and the burial of Antonio in the infirmary's garden. Rodriguez read in silence, his brow furrowed. At last he pushed the notebook away and sighed. "Do you understand what you are asking of me? To confront a charitable institution that shelters the sick and the poor. In a city already rife with unrest, even if I believe you, Inspector, others will say you seek to destroy faith itself." He promised to consider the matter, but gave no assurance of action. The contrast grew sharper with each attempt. Duarte's evidence against the bureaucracy's fear, truth against self-preservation. He was beginning to see what Salazar had hinted at when she gave him the journals, that the sickness in São Bartolomeo was not confined to its wards but ran outward into the city's institutions. The very structures meant to protect the vulnerable, the church, the council, the police, were now guardians of silence. Frustrated but not defeated, Duarte began drafting a more extensive dossier, assembling every fragment of testimony and artifact into a coherent whole. He transcribed entire passages from Salazar's journals, cross-referenced them with burial records from nearby cemeteries, and copied the parish note that acknowledged the midnight bells. He even included sketches of the doors, noting their inward locks and heavy bolts. At the top of one page he wrote, "These are not accidents. These are practices." Yet as he built his case, he noticed an unsettling shift in his own daily life. Twice he felt eyes on him as he walked home through the Alfama alleys. Once he found his apartment door slightly ajar, though nothing had been taken. He began to suspect that the infirmary or its allies were aware of his inquiries. The protection he had promised Salazar now seemed fragile indeed. One evening, as he prepared to deliver another memorandum, Duarte overheard two clerks in the bureau whispering about him. "They say he's become obsessed," one muttered. "He'll ruin himself if he keeps chasing shadows." Duarte realized then that the isolation was not only external. Even among his colleagues, he was being quietly marked as troublesome, a man who risked stability for truth. Still, he persisted. He wrote letters to higher officers, carefully phrased appeals that combined deference with urgency. In one, he asked pointedly, "If patients entrusted to a charitable institution cannot be guaranteed safety, what meaning does the word charity retain?" Weeks passed without reply. By late summer of 1889, Duarte understood the depth of resistance. The journals, the testimonies, even the graves were not enough to spur the machinery of authority into motion. The city did not want scandal. The church did not want shame. The infirmary's silence was matched by the silence of officials who preferred ignorance over accountability. And so Duarte found himself at a precipice. If the path of institution was blocked, he would have to consider another, to act without sanction, to seek entry into the wards himself, and to gather proof so undeniable that even the city's guardians of silence could not ignore it. The tension sharpened into a single contrast: obedience to authority versus loyalty to truth. For a man who had spent his career serving order, It was the most dangerous decision of his life. It was in the first week of September 1889 that Inspector Duarte Falcone resolved to cross the line from investigator to intruder. Months of memoranda, interviews, and appeals had yielded only silence or polite dismissal. He understood now that the authorities would never authorize a full search of San Bartolomeo. If anything was to be uncovered, it would have to be by his own hand. Yet he also knew he could not do it alone. He turned quietly to two men he trusted, Sergeant Almeida, a veteran of the City Watch, and a young constable named Pires, who had shown courage during street riots. They met after midnight in Duarte's flat near Rossio Square. The shutters drawn, the journals of Nurse Salazar spread across the table. The plan was crude but deliberate. They would enter under cover of darkness, using the small postern gate that opened onto the infirmary's rear garden. Salazar had whispered to Duarte that the lock was seldom checked. The sisters believed fear of sanctity kept intruders away. Once inside, they would reach the cellar, where records and supplies were stored. If luck held, they would find evidence that matched the journals, reserves of restraints, perhaps even unmarked graves. Duarte insisted there would be no violence, no confrontation unless forced. His voice was calm, but the tension in his hands betrayed his fear. He was about to trespass against both civil law and the church. The night of the raid was moonless, a sky heavy with clouds that muffled the stars. The three men dressed in dark coats, carrying only lanterns shielded with cloth. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rattle of a carriage. They approached San Bartolomeo from the eastern alley, where the walls were cracked and ivy crept upward. Salazar had left the small gate unlatched, just as promised. With a push, it swung open, and they stepped onto the infirmary's grounds. The air was thick with damp earth and the faint odor of lime. Inside the garden, shadows loomed over uneven soil. Duarte's lantern cast a muted glow on mounds that did not match the careful order of cemetery burials. Here the ground was hastily turned, unmarked by stones or crosses. Almeida knelt, pressing his hand to the earth. "Fresh," he murmured. "Too fresh for a garden." Duarte scribbled a note in his ledger, his throat tightening. Already the journals were confirmed. They slipped into the cellar through a narrow door half buried in the ground. The air inside was rank with mildew, but also with something sharper, iron and leather. Almeida lit his lantern fully, and the light fell upon shelves stacked with objects that chilled them all. Straps of leather, some stiff with old stains, iron cuffs attached to wooden boards, heavy belts with buckles large enough to bind a grown man. On one wall hung an inventory list written in neat script. Restraints, 24. Straps, 48. Chains, 12. It was not the list of a hospital. It was the ledger of a prison. As they examined the cellar, a sound echoed from above. Footsteps, then voices. The matron's sharp tone carried through the floorboards, followed by the measured clink of keys. Duarte realized with horror that they had been discovered or perhaps betrayed. He signaled to douse the lanterns. They crouched in darkness as the footsteps drew nearer. A door at the top of the stairs creaked open, spilling a faint shaft of light. "Who goes there?" a voice demanded. It was not the matron, but one of the orderlies, his voice coarse, suspicious. Duarte exchanged a glance with Almeida. They could flee back into the garden, but the cellar's door was too far, and the guard already descending. The inspector had not planned for open confrontation, but the choice was upon him: remain hidden and risk capture, or step forward and reveal himself under the badge of law. He chose the latter. Rising from the shadows, he called out, "Inspector Falcone, Municipal Police, you will stand aside." His voice was steady, though his heart pounded. The orderly froze halfway down the stairs, stunned by the authority declared in the darkness. For a moment silence hung between them, broken only by the faint rattling of the keys at the man's belt. Then came the matron's voice from above, cold and commanding. "Inspector, you trespass on holy ground. Leave at once or face the wrath of God and law alike." The confrontation was stark. Faith against justice, concealment against revelation. Duarte, lantern raised now, shone its light directly onto the racks of restraints. "Do not speak to me of God," he said quietly. "I have seen what you call charity." His words cut the silence like a blade. The matron did not descend further, but the threat in her tone was unmistakable. "If you publish lies, Inspector, You will answer before more than men. There are powers greater than you. The raid ended not with triumph, but with retreat. Realizing they were outnumbered and unarmed, Duarte ordered his men to withdraw, though not before Almeida tore the inventory, list from the wall and folded it into his coat. They slipped back into the night, pursued by shouts but not yet seized. The city lay silent around them as they returned to Duarte's flat, hearts pounding, hands trembling. They carried with them the stench of the cellar, the image of straps and chains, and the knowledge that their enemies knew of their intrusion. For Duarte, the night marked a turning point. He had crossed the threshold, seen with his own eyes the proof of cruelty, and confronted those who presided over it. Yet the cost was clear. The infirmary now knew he would not be silenced, and he knew they would not forgive. From that moment, the matter was no longer inquiry but battle. The morning after the clandestine raid, Inspector Duarte Falcão felt a heaviness settle over Lisbon, as though the city itself knew what he had done. The night's images replayed relentlessly in his mind. The unmarked mounds in the infirmary's garden, the racks of straps and chains, the matron's voice cutting through the dark like a blade. He had proof now, fragments but undeniable, but with that proof came exposure. The sisters and their allies would not sit idle. Within days, the first retaliation came. Nurse Salazar, who had risked everything by entrusting her journals to Duarte, was abruptly dismissed from the infirmary. No explanation was given in writing, but the whispers carried quickly through the neighborhood. She had been accused of moral corruption and seditious disobedience. To be expelled under such terms was not just the loss of employment. It was a stain that followed her into every parish and guild. When Duarte went to her lodging house, he found her packing what few possessions she had. Her eyes, once sharp with defiance, now brimmed with weary resignation. "I told you they would not forgive," she murmured. "Now I am marked. You must finish what I could not." Her dismissal sent a message to the other nurses. Silence was survival. Duarte returned to the infirmary days later, under official pretense, hoping to speak again with Sister Margarita, the one who had slipped him the coded note. She was gone. The matron informed him coolly that Margarita had been transferred to service in Coimbra, yet no record of such transfer appeared in the council's registers. Duarte suspected the truth was darker, that the young nurse had been removed not for service elsewhere, but to ensure she could not whisper again. The contrast was sharp and cruel, truth-tellers erased, loyalists preserved. Even within the police bureau, Duarte felt the tightening grip of isolation. His superior, Captain Teixeira, summoned him for a private reprimand. The captain's words were blunt. "Your nocturnal activities have been reported. You are accused of trespass upon a charitable institution. If you continue, you will not only lose your commission, you may face charges yourself," Duarte protested, producing the inventory list torn from the cellar wall. The captain barely glanced at it before sliding it back across the desk. "This proves nothing. You seek scandal where there is only discipline." The walls closed in further when Duarte discovered that his communications were being intercepted. A letter he sent to Councillor Rodriguez, enclosing selected excerpts from Salazar's journals, never reached its destination. Weeks later, he was shown the same letter by an intermediary, who claimed it had been misplaced in the chancery. The implication was clear. The infirmary's allies extended into the bureaucracy itself, hands willing to smother any attempt at exposure. For the inspector, the isolation was not merely professional, it was personal. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now avoided his gaze. At taverns, conversations hushed when he entered. He sensed that whispers of his obsession had spread, painting him as a man chasing phantoms, a danger to stability. His family, distant in Porto, wrote urging him to abandon the matter for his own safety. He did not answer their letters. The retaliations carried a weight of threat beyond dismissal or slander. One night, returning to his flat, Duarte found the door forced open. Nothing was stolen, but his desk had been rifled. The drawer where Salazar's journals were kept was left ajar, though the books themselves remained hidden beneath false boards. On his bed lay a single object, a leather strap, coiled like a snake, the buckle glinting in the lamplight. It was a warning, unmistakable and intimate. Still, he refused to relent. He documented each act of retaliation as carefully as he had documented the bells. The bruises, the journals. His notes for September 12th read, Salazar dismissed. Margarita vanished. Intrusion into lodgings. Object placed as threat. Pattern of suppression. Confirms organized concealment. He no longer wrote as a simple inspector gathering evidence for superiors. He wrote as if building a record for history, for posterity, for a future audience who might judge when his contemporaries refused. And yet the cost pressed upon him. Salazar now lived in poverty, scorned by those who once called her colleague. Margarita's fate remained unknown, a ghost in the corridors. Duarte himself felt the ground shrink beneath his feet, each day narrowing his choices. The contrast of the moment was total, exposure versus erasure, light versus the machinery of silence. Every ally who spoke was removed. Every door he knocked upon closed. He stood increasingly alone, clutching fragile pieces of truth against a tide of calculated suppression. It was in this state of isolation that Duarte began planning his next step, not to persuade the city officials, who had already turned their backs, but to preserve and protect the evidence in a form that could not be buried. The battle for San Bartolomeo was no longer simply about investigation. It had become a race against erasure, with his own safety hanging precariously in the balance. By the autumn of 1889, Inspector Duarte Falcão understood that the walls of San Bartolomeo were not the only place where silence was enforced. The city itself had become a kind of infirmary, doors locked from the inside, testimony barred, the sickly truth contained and starved of air. Every attempt to escalate had been thwarted, every ally erased. He no longer trusted his bureau, the council, or even the post. What remained was the preservation of what he had gathered. The journals, the coded note, the inventory torn from the cellar wall. If they succeeded in silencing him, at least the record would not die. His flat became a clandestine archive. At night, he copied Salazar's journals by hand, disguising them as devotional texts. The covers bore the titles of psalters and catechisms, but inside lay descriptions of bruises, locked doors and shallow graves. He placed duplicates in the care of an elderly bookseller he trusted, a man who had supplied him with legal tomes in the past. Duarte told him only, "Keep these safe. They may one day matter more than my life." The bookseller, accustomed to discretion, nodded gravely and hid them beneath a stack of forgotten volumes in his cellar. At the same time, Duarte attempted to secure the official records, only to find the archive itself had been tampered with. When he visited the parish office to request burial permits for the months surrounding Sue Antonio's death, he discovered gaps. Pages had been removed, entire weeks missing. The clerk shrugged, offering a hollow explanation about water damage. In the municipal bureau, patient transfer logs, once accessible, were now stamped with a red seal. Restricted by order of the council, Duarte saw the hand of the infirmary in these erasures, a systematic effort to cleanse the written record. The contrast could not have been clearer, his desperate preservation versus their calculated suppression. One evening, Salazar herself appeared at his flat, cloaked and trembling. She had been evicted from her lodging house after the matron denounced her as a corrupter of morals. She carried with her a final notebook, one she had hidden even from Duarte before. It was slimmer than the others, its pages brittle with age, but its contents devastating. In it, she described what she believed to be clandestine burials on the infirmary grounds, conducted under moonlight, with only a few trusted orderlies present. "They do not mark the graves," she had written. "They cover them as if ashamed, but the earth tells the truth. I counted 4 in one night." This notebook Duarte sealed inside a small wooden chest, together with the inventory list and Margarita's note. He locked the chest and placed it under the floorboards of his bedroom. Each night as he lay in bed, he felt the faint weight of it beneath him, a reminder of both his duty and his peril. But the more he preserved, the more the city seemed intent on rewriting. A pamphlet circulated in Lisbon praising São Bartolomeu as a sanctuary of mercy, signed by prominent clergy and councilmen. The pamphlet described the sisters as angels. Among the afflicted and denounced, recent vicious rumors as attacks against charity itself. Duarte recognized the pamphlet for what it was: propaganda, designed to drown his evidence beneath a tide of sanctimony. The public, he feared, would believe it. After all, pamphlets were printed truth, while his journals remained hidden in shadow. Even within the bureau, he felt the weight of rewriting. His own reports began returning to him, marked with edits and omissions. Key phrases were struck out: inward locking doors, evidence of restraint. Possible clandestine burials replaced with softened language about disciplinary procedures and unverified accounts. It was as though his pen had been seized by another hand. He copied his original drafts in secret, determined that one day they would be compared against the sanitized versions. Isolation deepened into paranoia. Duarte began to wonder whether he himself might be rewritten. His name recorded not as a seeker of truth, but as a disgraced inspector, dismissed for insubordination or delusion. Already, he overheard whispers in taverns, neighbors muttering about his obsession with shadows. If he fell, the official story would portray him not as a man who fought corruption, but as one who lost his reason. And so he wrote more urgently, as if racing not only against erasure, but against time itself. His notes from October 2nd contain a line that reads less like a police report and more like a plea. If I am silenced, let these pages remain. The infirmary is not a place of mercy, but of confinement. Not of healing, but of concealment. The dead are beneath its earth, the living behind its locks. The struggle had become existential, not only for the patients of São Bartolomeu, but for the very idea of truth. Duarte was no longer merely documenting abuse. He was fighting to prevent history from being rewritten into pious fiction. The infirmary sought to bury the bodies and the memory alike. His task was to ensure that if he could not save the living, at least the memory of what happened would not vanish into silence. By November of 1889, Inspector Duarte Falcão's position had collapsed beyond repair. His bureau no longer trusted him. His colleagues avoided him. And his name began to circulate in the papers in carefully orchestrated whispers. An anonymous editorial in Diario Popular described a certain inspector who had become unmoored, slandering charitable sisters and inventing horrors out of fevered imagination, though the piece never mentioned his name outright. Everyone in his circle knew whom it referred to. The campaign to discredit him was working. Duarte was summoned to the bureau one final time. This time not for reprimand, but for dismissal. Captain Teixeira delivered the words with cold formality. You have overstepped the boundaries of your office. Your continued agitation has endangered the city's peace. Effective immediately. You are relieved of duty. He was not permitted to speak in his own defense. When he attempted to submit his journals and notes as evidence, Teixeira refused to accept them, remarking only, "You will not stain the bureau with fantasies." Thus, the very institution charged with uncovering crime had sealed itself against truth. The contrast cut deep: duty versus obedience, evidence versus silence. Almost immediately afterward, Duarte's life unraveled in visible ways. Neighbors who once shared bread now locked their shutters when he passed. At church, parishioners shifted away from his pew. Even the bookseller who had promised to protect the journals began to waver, whispering that he feared the wrath of the sisters if his role were discovered. Salazar, already destitute, fled Lisbon for Porto, leaving Duarte increasingly alone. Meanwhile, São Bartolomeu itself underwent a sudden transformation. New paint covered its outer walls, fresh linen was hung in its wards, and the city's notables were invited on carefully guided tours. In these tours, the wards gleamed with order and devotion, the patients chosen for display clean and docile. Duarte knew it was a performance, a facade meant to overwrite the truth, but the public, hungry for reassurance, embraced the spectacle. The infirmary became a symbol of charity once again, while his warnings dissolved into the air. The suppression extended into the official records with brutal finality. The chest Duarte had hidden under his floorboards was discovered one night when he returned to find his room overturned. The boards had been pried up, the lock on the chest smashed, its contents were gone. He never learned who had taken them, whether it was the sisters' agents, the bureau, or another party entirely, but from that night onward, He knew his archive had been stripped from him. Only the copies in the bookseller's cellar remained, and even those he doubted would survive long. Within weeks, the council announced that after thorough review, no evidence of misconduct had been found at São Bartolomeu. The case, they declared, was closed. Duarte himself was branded unstable, whispered about as a man consumed by obsessions, perhaps even touched by the very madness he claimed to expose. He became a pariah, a ghost moving through the city he once served. The aftermath was cruel not only in what it destroyed, but in what it concealed. The patients remained behind locked doors, their stories sealed away. The nurses who had tried to speak, Salazar, Margarita, vanished from the record, their testimonies excised as if they had never lived. Public memory shifted, polished by pamphlets and proclamations until the notion of abuse at the infirmary seemed almost absurd. In the eyes of Lisbon, there was no scandal, no graves, no cries in the night. Duarte kept writing even after dismissal, filling scraps of paper with fragmented recollections. "The truth," he wrote in December, "has been buried deeper than the bodies. What remains is silence dressed as mercy, cruelty rewritten as devotion." His handwriting grew increasingly erratic, his words laced with bitterness. By the year's end, he had disappeared from the city altogether. Some claimed he fled abroad. Others whispered he had been committed to a sanatorium himself. The final irony. The council ordered all remaining records sealed, citing the protection of the infirmary's dignity. The archives of 1889 would not be reopened for decades, and even then, the pages most relevant to São Bartolomeu were curiously absent. The suppression was complete, a victory for silence over speech, for institution over individual. Yet beneath this official erasure lingered the faint shadow of Duarte's defiance, the memory of one man who refused to close his eyes. The story of São Bartolomeu does not end with the dismissal of Inspector Duarte Falcão, nor with the pamphlets and proclamations that painted the sisters as saints. It ends in silence, a silence cultivated, curated, and enforced. Yet silence is not emptiness. It is a weight, an active presence, pressing upon history like a hand across the mouth of the dead. What survives today of 1889 is not the cries of the patients or the private testimonies of nurses, but the official record, a polished, sanctified narrative of devotion. And yet, in the cracks of that narrative, there remains the shadow of another truth, faint but persistent. The case of São Bartolomeu reveals the perilous contrast between what is seen and what is hidden, between the public face of charity and the private machinery of confinement. An infirmary was presented as a sanctuary, but its doors locked inward. It promised healing but enforced silence. It declared itself a place of mercy, but bore the marks of restraint, shallow graves and lives erased. The inspector, for all his failings, became a symbol of resistance, a man attempting to preserve memory, while institutions labored to bury it. Philosophically, the story poses a question that lingers beyond its century. What is more dangerous to justice, the cruelty itself, or the suppression of cruelty's memory? A blow may kill the body, but erasure kills the witness. If the patients of São Bartolomeu died in neglect, and if their names were scrubbed from registers, their suffering was doubled, first endured, then denied. Duarte understood this, which is why he copied, hid, and wrote until his last days in Lisbon. His fear was not merely that the patients would die, but that history would declare they had never lived. Ethical transparency requires us to acknowledge that much of this story is drawn from fragments, from whispers preserved in secondary sources, from testimonies recorded decades later by those who claim to remember Duarte. There is no complete file. There is no ledger of the dead. What remains are traces, Salazar's journals, partial at best, a single coded note attributed to Margarita, Duarte's scattered fragments, smuggled through private hands before his disappearance. Whether these fragments are sufficient proof or not, they raise a haunting question. Why would so much effort be spent on suppression if there were nothing to suppress? As viewers, as listeners, as inheritors of history, we must grapple with the uneasy tension between faith in institutions and suspicion of silence. Was São Bartolomeu a sanctuary maligned by rumor, Or was it an asylum where mercy was only spoken for public ears, while suffering reigned behind locked doors? The truth, once sealed away, may never be fully retrieved. And yet the act of remembering, even imperfectly, even with uncertainty, becomes an ethical duty. To recall is to resist the erasure that institutions strive to enforce. In the end, the story of the infirmary, that locked from the nurse's side, is not only about Lisbon in 1889, it is about every place where records are scrubbed, where testimony is dismissed, where victims are called liars or mad, and where silence is praised as peace. It reminds us that history is not a neutral ledger, but a battleground, where the pen can be used to heal or to erase. So we close with this reflection, and with a question for you. If silence itself can be weaponized, what responsibilities fall upon those who hear whispers from the past? Do we accept the polished record and turn away? Or do we bear witness to fragments, knowing that even broken truth is more honest than a perfect lie? Before we part, a note on this dramatization. What you have heard is drawn from period accounts, archival fragments, and reconstructed testimony. It is not meant to sensationalize, but to honor the possibility that forgotten lives mattered. If you value stories that confront silence and expose uncomfortable shadows, consider sharing your thoughts. Where are you listening from? And what does this story make you reflect upon in your own history? Because in the end, the infirmary's doors are still locked in one sense. The past remains closed until we choose to open it. The question is, will we?